Nona Dirksmeyer was young, beautiful, and full of promise. Grayson Calloway was the devoted boyfriend who found her lifeless body. Sawyer Redman was the quiet neighbor with a dark fascination. Damon Lasky was the stranger whose bloody fingerprint was left behind. One of them held the key to her murder, but which one? When Nona was brutally killed in her apartment, the case seemed straightforward at first. But as investigators dug deeper, the truth became more twisted than anyone could have imagined. Secrets unraveled, suspects emerged, and the town of Dardanelle was left questioning everything they thought they knew. In a murder case filled with jealousy, obsession, and shocking twists, one question remains: who really killed Nona Dirksmeyer? Dardanelle, Arkansas was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked at night, where neighbors greeted each other by name, and where crime rarely made the news. It was a place where life moved slowly, where the biggest events were high school football games and church gatherings. That all changed on December 15, 2005, when a brutal murder shattered the town's sense of security. Nona Dirksmeyer was just 19 years old. A college student with dreams of making a difference, she was well-liked, talented, and beautiful. She had been a high school pageant queen, known for her kind smile and soft-spoken nature. People described her as warm-hearted, always willing to lend a hand or share a laugh. But on that cold December evening, the life she had built was suddenly and violently taken from her. It was her boyfriend, Grayson Calloway, who made the horrifying discovery. He had been trying to reach Nona all afternoon, but his calls had gone unanswered. At first, he assumed she was busy, maybe studying or taking a nap. But as the hours passed, unease crept in. He decided to check on her. When he arrived at her small apartment, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. The door was unlocked, the lights were on, the air inside felt heavy, thick with an eerie silence. Then he saw her. Nona's body lay on the floor near the living room. Blood pooled around her head, dark and congealed. There were signs of a struggle. Overturned furniture, scattered belongings. It was clear that she had fought for her life. Grayson screamed, his voice raw with terror, and called 911 on her radio. Within minutes, the police arrived, but it was already too late. Nona Dirksmeyer was gone. Detective Bennett Westcott, a veteran officer with decades of experience, was one of the first investigators on the scene. As he surveyed the apartment, he knew right away that this wasn't a simple break-in gone wrong. There was no sign of forced entry, no shattered windows, no evidence that a stranger had broken in to rob her. That meant one thing: Nona had likely known her killer. As news of her murder spread, the town was thrown into chaos. People gathered in small groups, whispering theories and fears. Parents held their children a little closer. Doors that had once been left open were locked, and a sense of unease settled over Dardanelle like a heavy fog. Nona had been loved by so many, and the thought that someone among them, someone they might see at the grocery store or wave to on the street, had done this was chilling. With no immediate suspects, investigators turned their attention to the people closest to Nona. Who had the motive? Who had the opportunity? And, most importantly, who had the capacity to commit such a brutal and personal act? The answers to those questions would send shockwaves through the community and reveal dark secrets no one had seen coming. Grayson Calloway sat in the small, windowless interrogation room, his hands trembling as he rubbed them together. His face was pale, his eyes red from crying. He had been the one to find Nona's body, the one who had made the frantic call to 911.0. But now, instead of being comforted, he was being questioned. Detective Bennett Westcott watched him closely. In cases like this, the boyfriend was always a person of interest. Grayson claimed he had been out with friends before coming to check on Nona. But something about his story felt off. His timeline had gaps, little moments that couldn't quite be accounted for. When pressed for details, his answers became vague. The nature of Nona's murder was brutal. There were multiple injuries, and it was clear that whoever had killed her had been filled with rage. It wasn't the work of a random intruder looking to steal a television or some loose cash. This had been personal, and that meant that someone close to her had likely done it. Grayson and Nona had been dating for years, but their relationship had been far from perfect. Friends described moments of intense love, followed by heated arguments and long periods of silence. Some said Grayson had a jealous streak, that he didn't like Nona talking to other men. There were even rumors that he had tried to control who she could be friends with. But was he capable of murder? As investigators dug deeper, they found something troubling. On the night of the murder, Grayson had sent Nona multiple messages. First, they were affectionate, asking how her day was going. But when she didn't respond, they grew impatient. Then came a message filled with frustration. "Are you ignoring me?" It was the last text he sent before he drove to her apartment. But that wasn't the only concerning discovery. Inside Nona's apartment, officers found a bloody fingerprint near her body. It was partial, smudged, but it was there. Forensic teams worked quickly to process it, hoping it would give them a direct link to the killer. When the results came back, everyone braced for the answer. But the print didn't match Grayson. For the first time since the investigation began, doubt crept in. If Grayson wasn't the one who left that print, then who had? The case wasn't as simple as it first appeared. There was someone else in the picture, someone who had been inside Nona's apartment that night. That was when a new name surfaced: Sawyer Redmond. Sawyer lived in the same apartment complex as Nona. He wasn't a close friend, but people had seen him around. He was quiet, withdrawn, the kind of person who kept to himself. But there were whispers that he had been watching Nona, that he had taken an unusual interest in her. The investigation had taken a sharp turn, and suddenly, Grayson wasn't the only suspect anymore. Sawyer Redmond had always been somewhat of an outsider. He had moved into the apartment complex a year earlier, keeping mostly to himself. Neighbors described him as odd but not threatening. He worked odd jobs, never staying in one place for too long. But after Nona's murder, his name started coming up in hushed conversations. People recalled seeing him watching her, lingering near her apartment at odd hours. Some even claimed he had tried to talk to her a few times, though she never seemed interested. The police brought Sawyer in for questioning. Unlike Grayson, he didn't cry or seem distraught. He answered questions calmly but avoided eye contact. He insisted he didn't know Nona personally, that he had only seen her in passing. But detectives weren't convinced. He lived in the same building. He had opportunity. And then there was the matter of the bloody fingerprint. If it didn't belong to Grayson, could it be Sawyer's? Forensic teams rushed to compare the print to Sawyer's fingerprints. The police, the media, and the entire town waited anxiously for the results. But when they came back, they revealed something unexpected. The print wasn't a match for Sawyer either. This was a devastating blow to the investigation. Two suspects, two potential motives, yet the most crucial piece of evidence didn't belong to either of them. But even without forensic proof, detectives still weren't ready to let Sawyer go. There was something about him, something that didn't sit right. When they searched his apartment, they found a jacket with a torn sleeve. It might not have meant much under normal circumstances, but inside Nona's apartment, crime scene investigators had found a small piece of fabric near her body. The colors matched. It was enough to justify holding Sawyer a little longer, hoping he would slip up under pressure. As the town watched the investigation unfold, many believed Sawyer was guilty. His strange behavior, his apparent fixation on Nona, it all seemed to add up. When the case went to trial, the prosecution presented their case with confidence. They argued that Sawyer had been obsessed with Nona, that she had rejected his advances, and in a fit of rage he had killed her. The torn fabric was a key part of their argument, proof that he had been in her apartment during the struggle. But then, just as the trial seemed to be heading toward a conviction, the defense presented a stunning counterargument. The bloody fingerprint, the most damning piece of physical evidence, had been tested again, this time using an updated forensic database, and what it revealed changed everything. The fingerprint belonged to someone else entirely. A man with no known connection to Nona. A man named Damon Lasky. With this revelation, the case against Sawyer collapsed. The prosecution no longer had a solid case, and Sawyer was acquitted, but the real question remained. Who was Damon Lasky, and what was his connection to Nona Dirksmeyer? The revelation of Damon Lasky's fingerprint sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Up until that moment, everyone had been convinced that Sawyer Redmond was the killer. But now, the case had taken an unexpected turn. Damon was a name no one had heard before. He wasn't from Dardanelle. He had no known ties to Nona. Yet, there was his fingerprint, stained with blood, found near her lifeless body. Detective Bennett Westcott immediately launched a deeper investigation into Damon. What they found was troubling. Damon Lasky was a 32-year-old construction worker who traveled from state to state, taking short-term jobs before moving on. He had a criminal record, mostly for theft and assault. Nothing that screamed murderer, but enough to suggest he had a violent side. What caught investigators' attention the most was that Damon had been working on a construction project just outside of town at the time of Nona's death. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. How did he end up in her apartment? Did he know her? And if he was the killer, why had no one mentioned seeing him around before? When police finally tracked Damon down, he was living 2 states away. They brought him in for questioning, but from the start, he denied everything. He claimed he had never met Nona, had never set foot in her apartment, and had nothing to do with her murder. But if that was true, why was his fingerprint at the crime scene? Damon had an explanation. He said that while he had passed through Dardanelle, he had never been anywhere near Nona's apartment complex. He suggested that maybe his fingerprint had been left somewhere else and transferred unknowingly. It was a weak defense, but without more evidence tying him directly to the crime, it wasn't enough for an arrest. Meanwhile, the town of Dardanelle was losing faith in the investigation. First, they had been told Grayson was the prime suspect. Then all signs had pointed to Sawyer. Now, with the case against Sawyer falling apart, people wondered if the police really had any idea who had killed Nona. Some still believed Grayson was responsible, that he had somehow covered his tracks. Others thought Sawyer had simply gotten away with murder. And now there was this new, unfamiliar name, Damon Lasky. A man who may or may not have ever even met Nona. With no way to definitively prove his involvement, Damon was released. Investigators kept digging, hoping to uncover more evidence, but nothing ever came. No additional fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no DNA that could link him directly to the crime. The case had hit a dead end once again. After months of failed leads, the investigation slowed to a crawl. The national media lost interest. The town grew weary, and as time passed, the hope of finding Nona Dirksmeyer's killer slowly faded. The case, which had once seemed so solvable, was now slipping through law enforcement's fingers. The murder remained a mystery. Years passed, but the murder of Nona Dirksmeyer remained unsolved. The case that had once gripped the small town of Dardanelle slowly faded from the headlines, replaced by newer tragedies and fresher scandals. Yet, for those who had known Nona, the pain never lessened. Her family was left with endless questions and no justice. Grayson Calloway struggled to move on. Though he had never been officially charged, suspicion had followed him everywhere. Some people still believed he had been involved, that the lack of conclusive evidence didn't necessarily mean he was innocent. He tried to start over, moving away from Arkansas, but the weight of Nona's murder stayed with him. Sawyer Redmond faced a different kind of torment. Even though he had been acquitted, the stain of being a murder suspect never truly faded. Many still saw him as the man who got away with killing Nona, regardless of what the courts had decided. He lived under a cloud of suspicion, and no matter where he went, the whispers followed. Detective Bennett Westcott never stopped thinking about the case. He had solved dozens of homicides in his career, but this one haunted him. He replayed every detail over and over, wondering if he had missed something, if there had been a clue hidden in plain sight that had gone unnoticed. He had always believed that murder cases had answers, that every crime had a solution if you just looked hard enough. But as the years passed, he started to doubt. Damon Lasky remained a mystery. His fingerprint had been found at the crime scene, yet he had never been charged. There simply wasn't enough evidence to tie him to the murder. He had disappeared from the public eye, and while police kept tabs on him, they had no legal grounds to make an arrest. He had denied everything, and without more proof, there was nothing they could do. Nona's family continued to fight for answers, but the years had chipped away at their hope. They had lost their daughter, and despite everything, police investigations, court trials, media attention, the person responsible had never faced justice. Every holiday, every birthday that passed without her was another reminder of what had been stolen from them. The town of Dardanelle eventually moved on, but the murder was never forgotten. People still talked about it in quiet moments, still debated theories about who had really killed Nona. Some believed the police had been too quick to focus on Grayson and Sawyer, overlooking other possibilities. Others thought Damon Lasky had gotten away with murder, and some feared that the real killer had never even been a suspect at all. To this day, the murder of Nona Dirksmeyer remains unsolved. The case sits in police files, gathering dust, waiting for the missing piece that might finally bring the truth to light. Until then, the question lingers in the minds of those who remember her. Who really killed Nona Dirksmeyer?